This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today I'm bringing you a bonus video. We're nearing the end of March of the Machine Limited with Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth preview season now underway, and as usual I like to use this time to look back at my set review for the outgoing limited format and discuss the cards I got wrong and why. My goal is always to get the set review up in time for pre-releases and for the launch of a format on Arena, and that of course means I'm not going to be right about every single card. Now that I've drafted the format about 60 times though, I can look back and point out where my predictions didn't pan out and explain why. We've got 17 cards to look at, so let's get started. First up, there is Invasion of Belenon. It probably doesn't surprise you that there are lots of battles on this list. It's a new card type. It was hard to predict how good they would be exactly, especially in the context of a brand new format, and this is one that I got really wrong. I can see where I was coming from in giving it a B- because I was thinking, you're overpaying for this 2/2 knight on the front side, but if you can attack the battle down and transform it, you get a pretty powerful effect in the form of an anthem. But there are a few problematic things here. One of them is that this format, in white especially, is kind of about curving out, and playing a creature that's this inefficient doesn't feel too great for the most part. Sure, you get something up front, but the rate you pay just isn't very good. Also, it turns out 5 for the amount of damage you have to do to this is kind of high. It's a lot harder. You're not going to be able to transform it like the turn you play it all that often. And the best battles in the format, they're cheap and they have generally lower than 5 damage that needs to be done to them. Additionally, usually if you're going to try to attack this, it usually means you're losing some creatures, which means the anthem is going to be less good. So this just ended up being really awkward, despite the fact that like the blue-white deck is a knight deck. You just never played this in it. And in general, white decks in the format don't like playing battles because they're not that good if you're in an aggro deck, and most of the white decks in the format are aggressive. So this ended up being like a D+, which means it's a card you really don't want to play. You can and get away with it. It's not going to destroy you, but it's not very good. Next up, we've got Serif of New Capenna. So I gave this one also a B-, so another one I overrated. I was thinking, it has Windrake stats up front. That's fine. It's not as good as it used to be, but it's okay. Still, a Windrake these days, like as the base level, is like a C- at best. So thinking that the upside this has was enough to make it a B-, it seems a little sketchy in retrospect, because you don't get that big of an upgrade when you transform this. Sure, it gains +1/+1, and it has this ability where it can hit harder. So it is an upgrade, but you're paying 7 total mana for this, and it just isn't that impactful most of the time. So it ended up just being okay. It was a C in the end. Next up, it's Sunblessed Guardian. Very similar. I thought, this is a decent 2-mana 2/2 up front, and then it can transform in the later game into something pretty relevant. But it's another case where what it transforms into just isn't that good. I gave this a C+ originally, so, pretty good uncommon that you would never cut. Turns out you do. This format has enough 2-drops that you're not so desperate to play this. It's, again, this isn't a terrible card. It's just significantly worse than a C+, and you have to pay a lot of mana here to transform it. And when you do, you get another +1/+1 boost. And yeah, you make a temporary token when it attacks, but that token's usually not that big, especially by the time you transform this. So it ends up being a lot more underwhelming than I expected. It's more like a C-. Next, there's Artistic Refusal. So I gave this a C originally, thinking, it will be okay. You play the first copy in most of your blue decks. You don't take it very highly though. But it turns out this just feels like Cryptic Command a lot of the time in Limited, which is kind of insane. The Convoke cost is pretty easy to achieve, especially if you're in like blue-red, where you have multiple cards that make multiple bodies. Same is true in blue-white sometimes. And so you're able to cast this and tap down like 3 things and pay 3 mana. And when you counter a spell and then draw 2 and discard a card, the 2-for-1 is very powerful. If you've gone wide enough, you don't even really need to leave mana up. And this actually ended up being a really great uncommon, one that you do first pick sometimes. It was more like a B-. Next up, there's Invasion of Kamigawa. So again, this is one where I said, okay, the thing it does up front impacts the board, so it's probably okay. But it has a similar problem to, the white battle we saw that transforms into an anthem, where the effect it has isn't really worth the mana, and it's barely worth the card, really. I mean, the white battle we looked at Invasion of Belenon, that is, gets closer to actually giving you a full card of value than this does, because it, just freezing a creature down or stunning a creature down just isn't worth 4 mana. Like, you're really overpaying when that's what you're getting. And I thought of situations when I evaluated this, I was like, you'll play this, you'll tap their 1 blocker, and then you can attack this. And then what you get out of it is quite impressive. It's a 2/3 that draws you a card every time it damages a player or a battle. It's got flying. So I was thinking it was worth the fact that maybe it doesn't do the most efficient thing up front, but if you can transform this, it is a must kill. So I gave it a B-. This is going to be a good uncommon that you can sometimes first pick and that will basically always make the cut, and it just didn't pan out that way. It does have less than 5 defense, but 4 defense is still high enough that this was harder to transform. And then there's also the fact that there are many situations where your opponent can basically just let you attack this and transform it. And then like half the removal spells at common in the format kill it really efficiently. So you end up wasting a bunch of tempo. The initial effect often doesn't do enough to make up for that. And so this was actually a card you didn't usually play. It's more like a D+. Next up, I have Completed Huntmaster. I gave this a B-. I thought it would be a great sacrifice outlet, but it is another card where part of the problem is just how inefficient it is in a format where the most aggressive decks can really just tempo you out by tapping things down and having better creatures on the early game. This ends up being really clunky and not that good. It is still, a good sacrifice outlet, especially if you're in black-red and you have Furnace Rains, which is the card that lets you steal an opposing creature, because it's very cheap to pay for this ability. In fact, you get a treasure when you use Furnace Rains most of the time, so you can just pay for it and get rid of their creature. So it definitely has a home in the format, but it's not this like bread and butter uncommon for black decks that I sort of envisioned it being. Incubating is pretty good in the format overall, but this card sort of fell flat. I think it was a C in the end. Next up, I've got Etched Familiar. I gave this a C+. We saw a few sets ago a card called Vampire Spawn that was a 3-mana 2/3 that had the same effect, but when it entered the battlefield. And that card ended up really overperforming at like a C+ level. And I looked at this and I said, well, it has a useful creature type in Phyrexian, and it's pretty similar. It's not terrible sacrifice fodder because it can drain 2. And so I gave it pretty much the same grade that Vampire Spawn ended up deserving. But it turns out only doing this when you die is a lot worse. I mean, obviously Vampire Spawn does a thing immediately, like right when it enters the battlefield. It also can't be disrupted by exile effects. And also, this is another creature that is very inefficient and just doesn't fare that well in combat in this format. So in the end, it was more like a C-. Next, there's Final Flourish. I gave this a C+. So this card really ended up overperforming. I thought it was going to be pretty good. I mean, a C+ is a reasonably good grade. And I based that on the fact that, the base form of the card is something that would usually be like a C. But I thought it would be a little bit too difficult to consistently have things to sacrifice to make this do the -6/-6 effect. So I didn't quite think it was going to be premium removal or like the best black common. I think I had it as black's third best common, which I think in the end it was probably second. But anyway, it ends up being even easier than I expected to have fodder to sacrifice to this. There's just a bunch of stuff lying around in the format that just isn't that important. You've got 1/1 tokens, you have incubators you haven't transformed. You just end up having lots of nice things. The 1-mana 1/1 lifelink that can incubate from the graveyard. There's just so much synergy for this card in the format that it did end up being premium removal, and one of black's best commons. It was a B. Next up, I've got Invasion of Eldraine. So again, when I was evaluating battles for this format, I was sort of going with, I feel like the ones that impact the board in some way are going to be the ones that end up being really good. And we've already seen that's not entirely true, because Invasion of Belenon and Invasion of Kamigawa both impact the board, but they do what they do so inefficiently that they ended up not being very good. Well, with Invasion of Eldraine, I looked at it and I said, okay, I'm paying 1 extra mana for Mind Rot. It's not like Mind Rot is a good card in Limited. Although, unlike most Mind Rots, this does have the upside of turning into a creature eventually, potentially. And so I thought it was a C, a solid card for the format. But there's a few things that happened in this format that made this even better. One of them is that a lot of the decks in the format are grindier. So if you play this even on like turn 5, your opponent often still has 2 cards and they're still going to lose them. The problem with Mind Rot effects often is you have a hard time drawing them late because they basically don't do anything. This gets around that a little bit by being able to transform, but it just turns out players have cards in their hand in the mid to late game more often than they usually do in this format. Then once it transforms, I mean, it's not like a world beater or anything, but you do often get like a 3-for-1 out of this card between the discard effect and then transforming it into this 2/2 flyer that punishes your opponent for not having enough cards in hand. So in the end, this ended up being a really good battle, more like a B- than a C. Next up, we've got Render Inert. So I just straight up gave this a D. My thought process here was I just didn't see it working out consistently enough. Basically, I thought you really need to be transforming battles consistently with this, otherwise it's not really worth it. Sure, there are incubators in the format that this kills, but when you do that, most of the time, you're not really getting very good value, even if this replaces itself. So I just didn't see it consistently enough doing something meaningful. But it turns out it does. It's definitely a build around. In a deck that has like 2 or fewer battles, it is probably a D. But it's more like a C+ if you're playing in a deck that has 3 or 4 or 5 battles, especially if they're really good ones that, in general, you want ones that will transform immediately when you cast this, which is most of them. When you do that, it feels insane because you end up, of course, getting a real permanent out of it and drawing a card, so it feels like a 2-for-1. So it's good in some decks. You shouldn't play it in all your decks. I definitely see people playing it more than they should because they're like, well, I can hit an incubator. And it's true, that's not the worst fail case, but you really need to have enough battles or this just isn't worth it. Next up, we've got Harried Artisan. This is another one of these transform creatures that has ended up being underwhelming. And for kind of the same reason, I evaluated it wrong. I looked at the front side, 3 mana, 2/3 haste, that's passable. And then it has this late game or mid game upside where it can transform into a 3/4 flying haste. Well, turns out the front side was largely too inefficient to really be that good. I give it a C+ originally, by the way. And transforming this, while it is an upgrade, isn't that impressive either. So like the others we've looked at, the transformation doesn't give you any value immediately. The best ones do. The best transformers in this format do something when you transform them, so that even if your opponent kills it when they untap, you don't end up losing a massive amount of tempo, but that's what happens here. So in the end, this is like a passable red card, but not even one that always makes your deck. It was more like a C-. Next up, I've got Invasion of Ragatha. I was really high on this one. I gave it a B. I thought you would be able to consistently enough hit a battle and transform it, or be able to get enough value out of hitting your opponent and pinging one of their creatures to kill it, that this was going to be like seriously good. I like the idea of playing it in an aggro deck and having it as late game reach to finish your opponent off. And obviously, if you transform it, it transforms into something really impressive. The problem is, oftentimes this doesn't impact the board. There's not as many boards as you'd think with an X1 just lying around, and 4 damage to your opponent generally isn't worth using up a card on in limited, and this has high enough defense that transforming it is enough of a challenge. I kind of wish they'd just given it 4 just so you could like play multiple invasions of Ragatha to transform these. That would have been kind of cool, but maybe too good. In the end, it was just okay. It's not unplayable or anything. Often enough, you do pick off some X1 that's actually worth a card for this to feel okay, but you end up not playing it in a lot of your decks. It's more like a C-. Next up, I've got Marauding Dreadship, which I give a D+ to. This is one I underrated. I've talked about it some in my Nizzanotes series, which is a weekly vlog series where I sort of discuss the ongoing limited format, and this is a card I talked about because I don't really know how I came out thinking this was a D+ in retrospect. And some people said that in the set review video, like just on rate, that this was an okay card, and they ended up being right, because a 3 mana 4/1 haste that incubates 2, you can sort of look at that as a 5 mana 2/2 that gives you like a 4/1 haste vehicle token. And if it was worded that way, I would have liked it a lot more. But the way it is worded, I was sort of like, I don't know. Yeah, I get that the incubator can crew it. That's cool. The flavor makes sense and everything. But I just couldn't really imagine putting this in most of my red decks. But it turns out you do for a few reasons. One of them is just that the rate is better than I thought it was for reasons I just explained. And the other is that the black-red deck, as it often does, has a sacrifice sub-theme. And this makes 2 things you can sack for value without really feeling like you're giving up a full card to do it. So it ended up being a perfectly solid common. It was a C. Next up, there is Seed of Hope. I gave this a D. I thought too much about the worst case scenario on this card. I imagine situations where you pay 1 and you mill 2 cards and you get nothing, but that almost never happens. This format has a lot of permanence. I think battles replacing a lot of like instants and sorceries in the format made it so this format has even more permanence than normal. And so this often just feels like pay 1, surveil 2, put a card into your hand, gain 2 life. So sort of like I was talking about with the Dreadship, if it was worded that way, that I would have seen this as a solid card to include one of in most of your green decks. But it's not worded that way, and I immediately was like, what happens if I don't hit a permanent at all? But you pretty much always do. It's very, very rare to whiff. You have like a 99% chance of not whiffing. There are times where you cast this and you like put a removal spell you wanted in your graveyard and you hit a land, and that doesn't feel great, but most of the time this can help set stuff up for you. You know, looking at a couple of cards and getting one of them into your hand is a nice effect. The life gain ends up being pretty solid. You know, it's not an amazing card or anything, and it does get cut sometimes just because it doesn't do that much, but it does sort of thin out your deck and help you find things. It gets even better if you're in sort of a multicolor deck where, you know, this actually can sort of be fixing because it digs you deeper, you can find a land with it and so forth. So it ended up being a C, not a D. All right, let's wrap things up with 3 multicolored battles I was wrong about. So Invasion of Amonkhet is the first one. I thought this was going to be really good. I gave it a B-. That's a good grade, but it ended up being even better. The initial effect is pretty much worth the 3 mana you spend. You know, making your opponent discard 1, you draw 1, and then mill in a blue-black deck. Milling yourself ends up having a lot of value, especially because it also sets up Lazotep Convert, which can come into play as a copy of something, which that also ends up being super powerful on most board states. Almost no matter what is in you and your opponent's graveyards, you're going to get a creature that is awesome when it transforms. It has 4 defense, so that ends up being, you know, sort of a sweet spot where it's easier to attack these down significantly, it feels like, than 5 defense battles. So this ended up being probably the best non-rare, non-mythic battle in the set. It was a snap first pick like 99% of the time. It was pretty close to just being a bomb because of the value it generated. But in the end, I don't think it was like unbeatable the way a bomb kind of has to be. It was just like insane value. You kind of end up with a 3-for-1 in the end for very little mana, and then you also get some synergy for your deck. So it was a B+ in the end. It was amazing. Next, there's Invasion of Kylem, where I went the other way in the wrong direction. I also gave this one a B-. So I sort of envisioned the ideal scenario when you cast this thing, which is, okay, play this, buff 2 of my creatures. Immediately, I'm able to attack the Invasion of Kylem and probably put my opponent in a situation where they either have to block or let me get Valor's Reach Tag Team. So the problem there is that this just doesn't end up lining up as well as you would want. There are lots of times where your opponent just has like expendable creatures they can block with and they don't really care. And you don't get a toughness boost, so it's not like you're really able to attack that much more effectively for a single turn. Sometimes you just don't have 2 creatures in play. Like, it ended up being a very awkward card and way worse than a B-. It was nearly unplayable. I think there are probably some red-white aggro decks in the format that could maybe make use of it, but it was like a D- in the end. Then there's also Invasion of Moog, another one where I overrated it. I gave it a B. I thought this was going to be a great battle, one of the better ones in the set, and it's not hard to see why I thought that. I mean, on the front, you have a battle that puts a +1/+1 counter on every creature you control. That sounds like an awesome effect. You're probably overpaying for it by a little bit, but I didn't think it was by that much, especially if you could, you know, really effectively just curve out and then cast the invasion, and then, you know, maybe you can just attack Bloomwielder Dryads immediately once you have that going. Kind of like Invasion of Kylem, there were lots of board states where this was just awkward because it didn't buff your board by enough to actually do anything. And it was really a card that only felt really good in like the later stages of the game, at which point transforming it becomes a lot more difficult. So it ended up just being really awkward. There were decks, if you were in a really synergistic green-white +1/+1 counter deck, especially with the Signpost uncommon, like I had one of the early draft videos for the format, I had like 4 Invasion of Moags and 4 of that Signpost uncommon 2/2 with +1/+1 counters. That was pretty insane. It was, you know, a lot of crazy synergy, but how often does it actually line up where you get 8 Signpost uncommons or whatever? It just doesn't usually. And so Invasion of Moog, you know, the +1/+1 counter deck outside of uncommons really isn't that well supported. That played a role too. So in the end, it was like a C-, a card that you cut pretty often, even from your green-white decks. So that does it for this video. Like I said at the start, my Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth set review is right around the corner. It'll get going the day the full card gallery goes up for the set on June 9th. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already so you can stay aware. Thanks for watching.